There's a particular silence that exists at 2 in the morning when you're the only person awake in a building, staring at a terminal window, watching a test suite run green line after 18 months of red. I lived inside that silence for the better part of a year and a half. I want to start there, because everything that happened afterward only makes sense if you understand what those 18 months actually cost me, and what they were actually worth. I'm a senior software architect. I'd spent 6 years at a mid-tier fintech company building other people's visions before I finally sat down, in the January of the year that would eventually change everything, and started building my own, a proprietary workflow automation suite I'd nicknamed Meridian. Designed for mid-sized logistics companies drowning in the exact kind of manual data reconciliation hell I'd watched clients suffer through for half a decade. I built it alone, nights and weekends, in the spare bedroom of my apartment that I'd converted into an office with a standing desk and 3 monitors, and a whiteboard that eventually filled, floor to ceiling, with architecture diagrams nobody but me would ever fully understand. I want to describe the actual texture of that work, because I think people who haven't built something complex from nothing tend to imagine it as a single flash of inspiration rather than what it actually is, which is closer to 18 months of extremely patient, extremely unglamorous problem solving. I debugged a memory leak in the caching layer for 11 straight nights before I found it. A single misplaced reference buried 3 function calls deep. I rewrote the entire authentication module twice, once because I'd architected it wrong the first time, and once more because a security audit I paid for out of my own pocket flagged a vulnerability I'd missed. I tested edge cases obsessively. What happens if a user uploads a malformed CSV at 2 a.m. during a scheduled database migration? What happens if 2 API calls race each other by 11 milliseconds? Because I understood, in the specific way you understand something only after you've been burned by not understanding it, that enterprise software lives or dies on the edge cases nobody thinks to test. By month 14, I had something that worked. By month 18, I had something I was proud of, a clean, modular, genuinely elegant piece of architecture that I'd registered with the US Copyright Office the moment it hit a stable release candidate. Not because I expected anything to go wrong, but because 6 years in this industry had taught me that "I probably don't need to protect this yet" is exactly the sentence people say right before they need to have protected it 3 months earlier. I filed the registration in March. I kept meticulous commit logs, time-stamped and cryptographically signed through my version control provider, going back to the very first empty repository I'd created the previous January. I embedded, deep in the core libraries, a handful of functionally invisible watermarks, unique variable naming conventions, and a specific, deliberately unusual approach to error handling architecture that any forensic code review would immediately recognize as mine. The way a forger's brushstroke eventually gives them away, no matter how good the forgery looks on the surface. I didn't do any of this because I suspected my brother. I want to be honest about that. I did it because that's simply how you build serious software if you intend to ever commercialize it. And some old, tired instinct in me, the instinct of a woman who had spent her entire career having her technical competence quietly, persistently underestimated by nearly every man in every room she'd ever sat in, had simply learned over years to protect her work as a baseline habit. The way you lock a door not because you expect a break-in, but because leaving it open has never once been the safer choice. My brother Leo is 4 years younger than me, and for as long as I can remember, our family has operated on a kind of gravitational logic where his accomplishments counted double and mine counted, at best, as a rounding error. Leo dropped out of a computer science program halfway through his 2nd year, not because he lacked the aptitude, my mother has told me more times than I can count, but because the traditional system just doesn't work for creative minds like his, a sentence I've never once heard applied to any woman in our family who failed to finish something. Since then, Leo has drifted through a loose sequence of venture, a dropshipping business that lasted 8 months, a cryptocurrency consulting service that lasted 4, a podcast about disruptive entrepreneurship that recorded 11 episodes before quietly vanishing from every platform it had briefly existed on, each one greeted by my parents with the same specific, uncomplicated enthusiasm. The enthusiasm reserved in our family exclusively for my brother's ideas, regardless of whether those ideas ever produced anything measurable at all. I have built, over the same stretch of years, an actual career, A computer science degree, 6 years climbing the technical ladder at a company that trusted me with systems worth tens of millions of dollars. And now, 18 months of solitary engineering that represented the single most technically sophisticated thing I had ever created. My parents' response to any of this across a decade has consistently been some version of "that's nice, honey," delivered in the same tone you'd use for a child's finger painting, followed almost immediately by a question about whether Leo had found his footing yet. I don't say this to wallow in it. I say it because it matters for what happened next. Because Leo visited my apartment on a Saturday in September, 18 months and 1 week after I'd started building Meridian, ostensibly to borrow a suitcase for a trip he was taking the following weekend. And because I let him into my home office without a second thought, the way you let your own brother into a room in your own apartment. Because some part of me, even after everything, still hadn't fully updated its model of who he actually was. I remember the visit in fragments now. The way you remember an ordinary afternoon that only becomes significant in retrospect. Leo wandering into my office while I made coffee in the kitchen, commenting when I came back in on how intense my monitor setup looked, asking a handful of surface-level questions about what I was working on that I answered honestly and at the time without any particular caution. I told him it was a logistics automation platform, that I'd been building it solo for over a year, that I was planning to start pitching it to potential clients or investors within the next few months, once I'd finished a round of load testing. I didn't think anything of it when he asked to use my bathroom and was gone slightly longer than a bathroom trip usually takes. I didn't think anything of it when he left 40 minutes later with my old suitcase and a slightly distracted, slightly too cheerful goodbye. It didn't occur to me. Why would it have occurred to me that my own brother had spent part of that 40 minutes plugging a flash drive into my open workstation and copying an entire Git repository, 18 months of my life, onto a piece of hardware that fit in his jacket pocket? I found out what he'd actually done 2 weeks later, at a family dinner I almost didn't attend. My mother called it a celebration dinner when she invited me, which should have been my first clue, because our family doesn't generally throw celebration dinners for me. And I'd learned over the years exactly whose milestones warranted a reserved table at the good Italian place on Route 9. Leo was already holding court when I arrived, mid-story, gesturing with a glass of wine he'd clearly already had 2 of, my parents leaning in with the specific rapt attention they'd never once, in 31 years, extended to anything I'd said about my own career. And the CTO literally said it was the cleanest architecture he'd seen from an independent developer in years, Leo was saying, as I slid into the empty seat beside my father. They're talking about a 7-figure acquisition, Dad. 7 figures, for something I built basically from scratch. I felt my stomach do something strange and slow, a kind of cold, sinking recognition I couldn't yet fully articulate, even as some analytical part of my brain was already, quietly, running the math. What exactly did you build? I asked. I kept my voice light, curious, the voice of an older sister asking a reasonable question at a family dinner, even as something underneath that voice had already gone very still. A workflow automation platform, Leo said, warming instantly to the audience, to me, to anyone willing to listen. For logistics companies. Handles data reconciliation, API integrations, the whole pipeline. I've been working on it for a while, just kind of quietly, didn't want to jinx it by talking about it too early. A workflow automation platform for logistics companies, handling data reconciliation and API integrations. I sat very still at that table, my father's hand briefly squeezing my shoulder in the specific absent-minded way he did when he wanted me to share in a moment that had nothing to do with me. And I listened to my mother say, beaming, "See, Emily, this is what I mean about Leo. He's just got that entrepreneurial instinct. You could learn a lot from your brother, honestly. All that computer science education, and he just goes and builds something real without any of it." Without any of it. I want to sit with that phrase for a moment, because I think it tells you almost everything you need to know about the room I was sitting in, my mother, praising my brother for building, from nothing, the exact application I had spent 18 months of 11 p.m. debugging sessions and a paid security audit, and a formal copyright registration actually constructing. While dismissing my own 6 years of professional engineering experience as a credential that apparently disqualified me from the kind of real achievement my brother had, in her telling, simply willed into existence through sheer entrepreneurial magic. "Which company?" I asked, still keeping my voice light, still holding the fork I hadn't used in several minutes. "The one that wants to acquire it." Leo named the firm, a mid-sized tech company I actually recognized. A firm with a real compliance department and a real legal team and a reputation in the industry circles I moved in for careful, thorough due diligence before any acquisition closed. "We've got a meeting with their executives next month to finalize terms," he said, practically glowing. "I mean, I always knew I had it in me. I just needed the right idea." The right idea. My 18 months. My 11 consecutive nights chasing a memory leak, my rewritten authentication module, my copyright filing sitting, time-stamped and legally binding, in a federal registry 6 months before this dinner had even been scheduled. I felt the anger arrive first hot and fast, a genuine flash of something close to fury sitting directly behind my sternum. And then, almost as quickly, I felt something else slide in underneath it, cool and clear and startlingly calm. The specific, focused stillness I recognized from every difficult debugging session I'd ever pulled myself through by refusing to panic. My brother had just in front of my entire family described selling my own registered, watermarked, cryptographically time-stamped intellectual property to a company with a real legal department under his own name, with what I now strongly suspected was an indemnification clause promising the buyer he held clean, unencumbered rights to code he had never written a single line of. I smiled. I want to be honest that the smile was genuine in its own strange way, because somewhere underneath the fury, a different, colder part of me had already started doing the math on exactly how catastrophically my brother had just walked into something he had absolutely no understanding of. "That's incredible, Leo," I said, and I meant every syllable of it, though not remotely in the way he took it. "Seriously, congratulations." I excused myself to the restroom 4 minutes later, and standing in a dimly lit hallway of an Italian restaurant on Route 9, phone in hand, I opened a text thread I hadn't used in 8 months. Ever since I'd paid a patent attorney named Christopher raise a modest retainer to review my copyright filing and advise me on commercialization strategy for Meridian. "Christopher, something's come up. Need to talk as soon as possible. My brother just told our entire family at dinner that he's selling my software to company name as his own original work. Meeting to finalize terms next month. I have full copyright registration, commit history, and embedded watermarks proving sole authorship. What do we do?" I hit send, slid my phone back into my pocket, and walked back to the table where my mother was still telling Leo, for what I suspected was not the first time that evening, how proud she was of her brilliant, self-made son. I picked my fork back up and I finished my dinner, and I smiled at all the right moments, and underneath the table, my phone buzzed once against my leg with a reply I didn't read until I was safely back in my car. "Emily, don't say a word to him. Come into the office Monday morning. If he's already got a buyer's meeting scheduled, we may actually want him to get further into this before we move. Bring everything." Christopher Ray's office occupied the 14th floor of a glass building downtown, and I arrived Monday morning with a laptop bag containing 18 months of my life organized into folders with the specific, obsessive precision that had gotten me through every difficult project I'd ever shipped. He was younger than I'd expected the first time I met him, maybe 40, with the calm, unhurried manner of someone who had built a career out of moving carefully through situations other people found catastrophic. "Walk me through the timeline," he said, and I did, laying out my laptop and pulling up my version control history on the conference room's shared screen. The very first commit, dated 18 months and 3 weeks prior, a single file titled Meridian Core. Pi with nothing in it but a comment block outlining the architecture I hadn't yet built. I scrolled through months of commits after that, hundreds of them, each one time-stamped and cryptographically signed. A complete, unbroken record of exactly how this software had come into existence, one late night at a time. "This is good," Christopher said, leaning forward, scrolling through the commit history himself now, his expression sharpening into the specific focus of a professional recognizing a genuinely strong position. "This is very good. When did you file the copyright registration?" "March," I said, application numbers in the folder. "I paid for expedited processing. It came back approved in about 10 weeks, which puts the certificate date roughly 6 months before my brother's dinner announcement. And he has no idea any of this exists. None. He's never once asked me a technical question about my work in his life." Christopher nodded slowly, and I watched him pull up a fresh document, the specific business-like posture of a man beginning to build something. "Here's what I want you to understand, Emily, before we go any further. You have what I would call, professionally, an extremely clean case. Timestamped commit history predating his claimed development by well over a year. Federal copyright registration predating his sale by 6 months. And you mentioned watermarking." I pulled up a specific file, one of the core authentication modules, and walked him through it. A handful of deliberately unusual naming conventions in the error handling architecture. A specific, slightly idiosyncratic approach to exception logging that I'd developed years earlier and used consistently across every project I'd ever built, distinctive enough that any competent forensic code review would recognize it as a signature. The software equivalent of a fingerprint left on every surface I'd touched. "That's excellent," Christopher said. "That's the kind of detail that turns a strong civil case into an open and shut one. Most people in your position would panic right now and want to fire off a cease and desist to your brother immediately. Stop this before it goes any further. I want to talk you through why that's actually the wrong move." I already suspected where he was going, but I let him say it anyway, because I wanted to hear the actual legal architecture of the trap I was about to let my brother walk into. "Right now," Christopher said, "your brother has committed what's essentially a civil wrong against you, unauthorized copying, and probably an intent to misrepresent authorship, which strengthens your damages case but hasn't yet crossed into anything with serious teeth beyond that. If we intervene today, warn him off, force him to cancel the deal, the worst outcome for him is an awkward, embarrassing conversation and maybe some family fallout. That's it. He walks away having learned at most that he shouldn't do this again. But if he actually signs the acquisition agreement," I said, following the logic to where I already suspected it led, "he's not just copying code anymore." "Exactly," Christopher said. "Most enterprise acquisition contracts, especially for software assets, include what's called a representations and warranties clause. A formal, legally binding statement from the seller that they hold clean, unencumbered ownership of what they're selling, free of any third-party claims, often with a specific indemnification clause promising to cover the buyer's losses if that turns out to be false. If your brother signs an agreement like that, swearing under contract that he owns intellectual property he stole from his own sister, he's not just facing a civil copyright claim from you anymore. He's committed fraud against the buyer. That's a different category of legal exposure entirely: breach of contract, fraudulent misrepresentation, and depending on how the deal is structured and how much money changes hands, potentially wire fraud if funds cross state lines electronically, which for a deal this size they almost certainly will. I sat with that for a moment, turning it over, and I want to be honest that some old, reflexive part of me, the part that had spent 31 years quietly absorbing my family's dismissiveness rather than weaponizing it, flinched slightly at the scale of what Christopher was describing. This wasn't going to be an awkward dinner conversation anymore. This was going to be the kind of consequence that followed a person for years. "He did this to himself," I said finally, more to settle something in my own chest than to convince Christopher of anything. "I didn't put that code on a flash drive. I didn't walk into a boardroom and lie about who built it." "No," Christopher agreed. "You didn't. And I want to be clear, my job here is to protect your intellectual property and your financial interests, full stop. What I'm describing isn't a strategy to maximize his suffering. It's simply what happens legally when someone signs a contract like this while lying about ownership. The severity is baked into his own choices, not into anything we're doing to him. We're just waiting for the facts to catch up to him instead of intervening early to soften the landing." "So what do we do in the meantime?" I asked. "We prepare," Christopher said. We build out the complete evidentiary package: a copyright certificate, full commit history, the watermark analysis, a sworn declaration from you establishing timeline and sole authorship. We draft the cease and desist and the formal notice of infringement now, so it's ready to deploy the moment he signs anything. And we watch. You said he mentioned a meeting next month to finalize terms. That's what he said at dinner. I don't have an exact date. Get one, Christopher said. Casually, you're his sister, ask him how the big deal is going, let him brag. He sounds like the type who'll volunteer the timeline without you having to work very hard for it. The moment you know he's signed or is about to sign, you call me immediately, and we move within hours, not days. Speed matters here. We want the notice landing on the buyer's compliance desk before any funds actually disperse, so they freeze the deal rather than having to claw money back after the fact. I spent the following 3 weeks in a strange, suspended state I hadn't experienced before. A kind of patient, watchful calm that sat oddly alongside the ordinary rhythm of my actual job, my actual life, my actual work still shipping on schedule at the fintech company, where none of my colleagues had any idea that a separate, much stranger drama was quietly unfolding in the background of my evening. I called Leo twice during those 3 weeks. Brief, warm, sisterly calls that cost me more than I let on, because some part of me still recoiled at performing an interest in his fraud that I absolutely did not feel. But I asked the questions Christopher had suggested, framed exactly the way an actually proud, actually supportive older sister might frame them, and Leo, predictably thrilled to have an audience, told me everything I needed without a hint of suspicion. They want to close by the end of the month, he told me during the second call, practically vibrating with excitement through the phone. Their legal team's drawing up the final paperwork now. $7.2 million, can you believe that? $7.2 million for something I built in my spare bedroom. That's amazing, Leo, I said, and I meant it in the specific, technical sense that the number itself genuinely was amazing. An enormous overvaluation of a product he'd never once opened a code editor to build. A number that told me, more clearly than anything else, exactly how much financial exposure was about to land on a 27-year-old with no legal counsel of his own reviewing an acquisition contract. He almost certainly hadn't read closely enough to notice the exact language of the warranty clause he was about to sign. When's the signing? I asked, keeping my voice light, curious, the tone of a sister planning to send flowers. 2 weeks from Thursday, Leo said. They're flying me out to their headquarters for it, actually. It's a whole thing. Dinner with the executive team the night before, signing ceremony the next morning. I'm telling you, this is it. This is the thing that finally proves I've got what it takes. I hung up that call and sat for a long moment in my quiet apartment, in the same office where he'd stolen 18 months of my life off an open workstation. And I felt something settle in my chest that I can only describe as a strange, unfamiliar peace. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but the specific stillness of watching a plan you've built carefully finally begin moving under its own momentum, gathering a weight and a speed that no longer required anything further from you except patience. I texted Christopher the date. His reply came back within minutes, brief and businesslike, exactly the kind of message I'd come to appreciate from him. Got it, we'll have everything finalized and ready to file the moment he signs. Don't contact him again before then, let this play out exactly the way it's currently heading. You've done the hard part already. Now we wait. I spent the 2 weeks that followed finishing a quarter's worth of work at my actual job, keeping my evenings unusually quiet, and resisting, with an effort that surprised me, the urge to check in on Leo's excitement one more time, to hear him describe one more time the exact shape of the trap he was building for himself out of nothing but his own arrogance and my family's decade of uncritical adoration. On the Thursday morning of the signing, my mother texted the family group chat a single photo, Leo in a rented navy suit, standing outside a glass office tower I recognized from the tech company's public headquarters photos, grinning into the camera with the specific, unguarded confidence of a man who has never once, in his entire life, seriously considered the possibility of consequences. Our boy is about to make history. My mother had written 3 exclamation points, an emoji I didn't bother identifying. I looked at the photo for a long moment, sitting at my own desk in my own home office, the same room where all of this had actually begun, and then I picked up my phone and called Christopher. He's there, I said, signings this morning. "Understood," Christopher said, and I could hear, underneath his usual calm, something that might have been the faintest trace of satisfaction. "Everything's ready on our end. The moment you confirm the contract's executed, we file within the hour." I sat back in my chair, looking at my own monitor, my own 3-monitor setup, my own 18 months of work still sitting exactly where I'd built it. Untouched, unstolen in any way that actually mattered, protected months before my brother had ever plugged a flash drive into a USB port he had no business touching. And I waited. The confirmation text from Leo arrived at 11:52 that morning, sent to the family group chat with the specific breathless triumph of a man who has just watched a number with 6 commas land in his bank account for the first time in his life. Signed, "It's official. 7.2 million. I still can't believe this is real." Followed by a photo, Leo shaking hands with a man in an expensive suit, both of them grinning for what was clearly a posed corporate photograph, a glass conference table and a wall of city skyline visible behind them. I forwarded a screenshot of the timestamp to Christopher without comment. His reply came back in under 2 minutes. "Confirmed, executed. Filing the infringement notice and cease and desist with their general counsel's office now. This should land on their compliance desk within the hour." I want to describe what the next several hours actually felt like from where I sat, because I think it's important. I didn't do anything dramatic. I didn't sit by my phone refreshing anything. I made lunch. I answered a Slack message about a deployment scheduled for the following week. I lived for those several hours, an almost aggressively ordinary Thursday afternoon, while somewhere across the country, a document with my name and my copyright registration number and 18 months of cryptographically timestamped proof of authorship landed on the desk of a general counsel who had, less than 4 hours earlier, authorized the wire transfer of $7.2 million for intellectual property that had just been definitively proven to belong to someone else entirely. The first sign that something had shifted arrived a little after 3 that afternoon, in the form of a call from my mother that I let go to voicemail, followed 90 seconds later by a second call that I also let go to voicemail, followed within another 2 minutes by a text message so uncharacteristically frantic in its punctuation that I actually felt a small, private flicker of something close to satisfaction reading it. "Emily, call me right now. Something is happening with Leo's deal. You need to call me immediately. This is an emergency." I let it sit for 11 more minutes. Not out of cruelty exactly, though I won't pretend there wasn't some small, human part of me that wanted those 11 minutes for myself. A last quiet stretch of ordinary life before I stepped fully into whatever was about to unfold. And then I called her back. "Emily, thank God." My mother's voice arrived already at a pitch I'd rarely heard from her, thin and fast and genuinely frightened. "Something's gone terribly wrong with Leo's company deal. They're saying," his lawyer called, "they're saying someone filed some kind of copyright thing. They're freezing all the money. Leo's completely panicking. You need to call him. You need to help him figure out what's happening." "What exactly did the notice say?" I asked. I kept my voice level, curious, the voice of a concerned sister asking reasonable questions, even though I already knew, with a precision my mother couldn't begin to imagine, exactly what the notice said because I'd read a draft of it myself 2 weeks earlier. Something about a registered copyright, some third party claiming they built the software. Leo says it's insane. He says he built the whole thing himself. He doesn't understand where this is even coming from. "Mom," I said, and something in my voice must have carried more weight than I intended because she actually stopped talking. "I built it. I built Meridian. Leo copied my entire codebase off a flash drive when he visited my apartment in September, and then he sold it to a tech company as his own work, and he signed a contract this morning swearing under oath that he owned it free and clear. He didn't build anything. He stole it, and today he committed fraud on top of the theft." The silence that followed was the longest I think I'd ever experienced on a phone call with my mother. A silence dense with the specific, disorienting work of a person trying to reassemble a version of reality that had just collapsed underneath her without warning. "That's not Emily. That doesn't make any sense. Why would you have? You never said anything. You let him." "I let him sign the contract," I said. "Because that's when he stopped being a brother who stole from his sister and started being a man who committed fraud against a corporation. And those are two very different problems with two very different consequences. I have the copyright registration. I have 18 months of commit history proving I built every line of that software before Leo ever touched a keyboard. I have a patent attorney who's been managing this for weeks. This isn't a misunderstanding, Mom. This is exactly what it looks like. You did this to him, she said, and I heard, underneath the shock, the old, familiar reflex beginning to surface. The instinct that had governed 31 years of my family's math. The instinct that made my brother's failures somehow always, ultimately, someone else's fault. You let him walk into this instead of stopping him. He walked into it himself, I said. I didn't put my code on a flash drive and carry it out of his apartment. I didn't stand in a boardroom and lie about who built something. He did that. Every single step of what's happening to him right now, he did to himself. I just made sure there was proof. Leo called me directly 40 minutes later. And I want to describe his voice in that call, because it was almost unrecognizable from the man who had grinned into a corporate handshake photo that same morning. Thin, fast, cracking in places. The voice of someone who had spent an entire adult life gliding through consequences on the strength of other people's willingness to absorb them. Encountering, for the first time, a consequence that no amount of family enthusiasm could soften. Emily, you have to fix this. You have to call them, tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them we're family, that we can work something out. I'm not calling anyone, I said. You signed a warranty clause this morning promising a company you held clean intellectual property rights to software you copied off my computer without my knowledge. That's not a misunderstanding I can smooth over with a phone call. That's fraud, Leo. You committed fraud. I didn't know it would, I just thought, you weren't even doing anything with it yet. You hadn't sold it to anyone, I figured. You figured it was fine to steal something as long as I hadn't monetized it yet, I said, and I found, saying it out loud, that I wasn't even particularly angry anymore, just tired and clear. In the specific way you're clear after a long debugging session finally resolves into an answer you can actually see. Leo, I registered that software with the US Copyright Office in March. I have 18 months of time-stamped proof that I built every function, every module, every line before you ever touched it. There is no version of this where you didn't know exactly what you were doing. You just never imagined I'd protected it well enough for it to matter. He didn't have an answer for that. I listened to him breathe unsteady on the other end of the line, and for a moment, a small, old part of me, the part that had spent a childhood watching my little brother stumble through things and instinctively wanting to catch him, almost softened. I let the moment pass instead. What happens now? He asked, finally, in a voice considerably smaller than the one that had opened the conversation. Now the company's legal team decides how they want to handle the fact that you defrauded them, I said. My attorney tells me they're already discussing breach of contract and fraudulent misrepresentation claims, on top of whatever they decide to pursue against you directly for the false warranty. That has nothing to do with me anymore. I'm not going to lie to a company on your behalf, and I'm not going to pretend to protect you that I didn't build something you stole. The fallout in the weeks that followed moved with a speed and a thoroughness that I think surprised even Christopher, who told me, in a follow-up call once the dust had genuinely begun to settle, that this was one of the cleanest cases he'd handled in years. Clean in the specific technical sense that clean had meant in Diane Castellano's mouth once, years before I ever met her. In a story I'd only hear much later and recognize immediately as strangely similar to my own. The tech company's compliance department, once they'd reviewed the copyright registration and the commit history and the watermark analysis Christopher's team provided, froze the entire acquisition within 48 hours, clawing back the small initial disbursement that had already gone out and formally rescinding the agreement on the grounds of fraudulent misrepresentation. Their legal team, according to a follow-up letter Christopher received, was independently evaluating whether to pursue Leo for the costs they'd already incurred in due diligence, and the reputational exposure of having nearly closed a deal built on stolen property, a pursuit that, last I heard through the same thinning family channels that still occasionally reached me, resulted in a settlement Leo is still paying off, quietly. Without the seven-figure fortune he'd spent a single golden Thursday believing was already his. My parents did not apologize, not in any clean, satisfying way I could point to as a resolution. What they did instead was go quiet in a manner I found almost more satisfying than an apology would have been. The enthusiastic group chat updates about Leo's genius dried up entirely. replaced by a careful, uncomfortable silence whenever his name came up at all. And my mother, on the one occasion she raised the subject again, months later over a stilted holiday dinner, said only, "I suppose we didn't fully understand what you'd actually built." A sentence that fell so far short of what the moment deserved that I simply let it sit there, unanswered, rather than doing the work of comforting her through her own belated recognition. I licensed Meridian eventually to a legitimate enterprise logistics partner I'd met through entirely separate, entirely honest channels, a deal Christopher negotiated over 3 careful months, resulting in a valuation considerably higher than the fraudulent number Leo had briefly, foolishly believed was his. I kept full ownership. I kept sole commercial control. I kept, most importantly, the 18 months of work exactly where they belonged, under exactly the name that had built. I still keep a photo on my desk now, not of Leo's handshake, not of any of it, a screenshot instead of my very first commit Meridian Core. Pi, an empty file with nothing in it but a comment block and a timestamp 18 months before anyone else ever knew it existed. I look at it sometimes when I need reminding of something simple, something I'd spent 31 years of family dinners slowly forgetting and finally, completely relearn, that the work was always mine, long before anyone else ever tried to tell a different story about it, and that some kinds of proof, built patiently and quietly enough, don't need anyone's belief to be true.